Greetings and salutations. You are listening to the Into the North podcast, where we take a look at the competitive side of the Commander format, also known as CDH. I am one of your hosts, Reed, aka Sick Robot, and today I'm joined by my co-host, singular, Morgan, aka Spleenface.
How's it going?
And in this episode, we're going to be covering something a bit different. We're going to be going over sort of how me and Morgan prep tournament lists, maybe like lists that we, like if you're not going to call them tournament lists, like lists that we want to optimize as much as possible for like a given meta, or aren't really building the deck to have fun brewing it, but more building the deck in order to, get wins with it and make a deck that we think is as good as possible.
Yeah, sort of how we approach more serious deck building.
Yeah, that's a much better usage of the term. This is also, for any viewers listening, this is a first for us in that this is actually going to be our first two-person Into the North episode. So we'll see how it goes. Let us know how you liked it. But realistically, this is mostly just because Matt and Lyndon couldn't make this recording and we need to get something out. So don't.
What are you talking
about? Too much if it goes
bad. Come on.
All right. So with that out of the way, let's just hop into housekeeping pretty quick. Of course, we always have to thank our new patrons. So thank you to Memo.
Thank you to Espen O.
TMH Legolas.
Daniel L.
And Victor S. You guys all rock. Thanks for helping out. I think this is the first batch of people that we're probably getting after our the release of our gameplay gameplay pilot. So thanks a lot. Much appreciated. Goes towards helping that, helping this, helping all of the above, paying us back for equipment that we never really paid ourselves back for, all that good stuff. So yeah, much appreciated. We'll go on to new developments now. So only a couple of things here. First of all, Oktoberfest is coming up on November the 18th to 20th in Philadelphia. Me and Morgan are going to be going to that one, so if you're heading out to Oktoberfest, make sure to find us at the venue, say hi, hang around for a bit, would be much appreciated, and yeah, I think it's going to be a good time. We didn't really get to see Philadelphia at Punt City, so I'm actually sort of like excited to, actually go check out the city and not have it be Copenhagen 2.0 for us. I mean, okay, never mind. We sort of solved the Copenhagen issue the last time we went, but
we saw a couple things. We did some stuff.
We did some
rode a 100-year-old roller coaster,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and the other new development we have, which will probably not be a shock if you're watching / listening to this on YouTube, is that we released our first gameplay episode just a couple weeks ago. If you follow us exclusively on a podcasting platform, you may not have seen that. So definitely go check it out. We're really happy with it, and it seems like you guys are too. So yeah, we're gonna be releasing. Looks like we're gonna be trying to release one of those a month. And yeah, check it out. Let us know what you think.
Yeah, super fun to record, and it's great to see everybody liking liking the result. Obviously as well, like, feel free to drop some suggestions and stuff. We actually have a channel in our Discord for if you're watching any of our gameplay and you have any ideas that you think we should know about. Yeah, feel free to let us know, because we're also all about improving it, because we want it to be high quality. I feel like it's already high quality, but we want it to be even higher quality. So yeah, let us know. Cool. So that actually gets us into the main topic here. So yeah, we're gonna be trying to go through like step by step sort of what our deck building process is for like real deck building, like real nitty gritty, like optimization, like deck building that takes place over the span of like literal months versus like 2 hours before a stream to put a jank deck together, and then like various tinkering at points of like 15 minutes per week after that. This episode is more about like how we do like if we know about a tournament like 3 months ahead of time and we want to prep a list for it like that, that's more about like how we go about that kind of deck building here. Um,
Yeah,
so
and it's
yeah,
also like we're really trying to get into. It's not necessarily like just a mechanical process, but we're trying to sort of discuss how we think about various facets of deck building, and we're going to be using the work we've been doing on Sacred Hermit over the last, I guess, year or so,
yeah.
as sort of a touchstone. So for those of you who have wanted us to go a little deeper on this deck, you're going to get some of our thoughts, but the episode is not going to be just focused purely around. It's not a Hermit Druid special episode, I guess
No.
is what I'm saying.
Yeah, it is. This is in fact just a regular episode. For anybody sort of not aware, I guess we should just give a quick rundown of like what we're actually like talking about in terms of that deck, just so nobody's completely blindsided and has to go look for lists. Although I will link, I guess I'll link a couple of the tournament lists that I have sitting around. Morgan, you can probably drop a couple as well, and I'll put them in the description.
Yeah, sure.
Just so you have context, but for anybody listening that doesn't have time to go check a link, Sacred Hermit is a Thrasios Timna Hermit Druid deck, which was it's playing some pretty stock packages, except more mid-rangey and like good cardy than you might historically see in a lot of like Turbo Hermit lists. As well as the fact that it is playing no white cards aside from Timna and Sacred Guide. Sacred Guide is basically a consultation on legs that requires you to not play any other white cards in your main deck. So sort of like just like it turns all your creature tutors into consults, which is pretty neat. And
And
that's
notably, it doesn't require tapping, so
yes,
it doesn't have the summoning sickness issue that either of Hermit Druid or Divining Witch have.
yeah. And this again for context is this has been the tournament list that we played for I think the past 6-ish months straight, or like the main tournament list.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, around there. So yeah, we've been playing in tournament for a while, and it was in development for like months before then. So we have like almost like a full year of a brewing process behind that one, which just makes it rife for examples for some of the sub points that we're gonna get into. But yeah. So I think we can probably move into the main topic then. I did want to put a disclaimer at the front of this too that so it's weird because like I hate coining new terminology terms, but this is definitely something that I feel like both me and Morgan have noticed that or like relatively recently have like actually verbalized and have been like, oh right, this is like actually a difference between like there are some people in the format that view deck building in some ways and some people that view deck building in other ways. So we are both, I think, what we would call empirical deck builders, meaning me and Morgan both build decks and like optimize and brew primarily based on our own like lived experience with those decks. So like we will put together a list from like cards that we think are good slash like put together like just a base list, and then our optimizations on that list will come from us playing games, very quickly recognizing like what we like about it, what we don't like about it, and then making card change or like swaps and changes to accommodate that. And that is in like as opposed to what I think we would call like theoretical deck building, which I would say Lyndon is a practitioner of like primarily to a pretty high degree, and I know a few other people. I would say Charles probably falls into mono white guy. Charles probably falls into being a theoretical deck builder as well, where a lot of the way that those people build decks is more based on the theory of like these packages should interact in this way, and like having a sort of like a framework going into the deck building without having like as much lived experience with testing the deck. I know that was a bit randomly. The point being, this entire like process like might be applicable to theoretical like or theory first deck building, but really this is like more describing our experience in our process as like experience first or empirical deck builders.
Yeah, and I think like generally, certainly the way we identify problems with our lists
Yes. Yeah.
is empirical in that it's like we play games, we try and get games against various different decks, and then it's like, okay, in this sort of situation, how comfortable am I? Do I feel like I need some more tools here or there, as opposed to sort of uh, crafting the deck with an approach of having like a more having or sorry crafting the deck with an approach where you try and think through all these problems and have solutions that maybe wind up like fitting together a little bit more nicely, because sometimes our process can lead to like swaps that look a little bit strange, and like they may even be wrong because we've had our experience has like disproportionately included certain types of issues that we've then like corrected for or maybe overcorrected for. So there's definitely advantages and disadvantages to both.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, that's just sort of how we approach it.
Um, and yeah, cool. I think I was about to add something else on, but it has totally left my mind at this point. So let's get into talking about the actual process. So I think we can probably start at like the beginning of like where we actually would start in this process, which is really just like basically identifying what deck we actually want to build. Which I mean, tons of different factors that go into this. I think just a few that we have written down here are I mean, the huge one, obviously, identifying like what niche you actually need a deck for. So this is stuff like what's actually like what you anticipate being in a meta, or what is currently in a meta that you're trying to deal with. What are the type of play patterns that you need the deck for? What problems do you need the deck to solve? What do you need to be able to play through? Can you afford to skimp in some areas? What are those areas? What does that mean for the actual deck that you're putting together? Et cetera, et cetera, sort of like that kind of stuff. Um,
Yeah, I guess before we get deeper into that, I do want to
yeah,
say one of the things that sort of pushed us towards wanting to make this episode was a short discussion I got in on Reddit when there was a thread, someone was asking about Sacred Guide versus not Sacred Guide in Hermit Druid, and one of the comments, I'll read part of it, and I actually sort of wound up disagreeing, and that made me sort of think about why I disagreed, because what they were saying seemed at first blush to make a lot of sense to me, and then I was like, but that definitely hasn't been sort of our approach or experience. So why is that? And so what they said was, I think it depends on where you want to position yourself in the meta. If you're trying to be fast at all costs, Sacred Guide is probably a solid way to help yourself get there. Losing out on Silence really hurts, but most of the other cards you mentioned, which I believe were Dranith Magistrate, Ranger Captain, possibly I think they mentioned Enlightened Tutor,
yeah,
and Swords. But the other decks you mentioned fit more into a mid-range game plan. Anyways, if you're wanting to be a more mid-range deck, losing out on cards like those to make Sacred Guide work would just not really fit into that strategy. And so, like, I can see exactly why they were where they were coming from, right? Like the Sacred Guide is just an extra win con piece, and it lowers your overall card quality because there's a bunch of cards that you just can't play that are good and you want to play. Um, but I think like when we get into talking about sort of the games you're comfortable playing and the niches you're trying to fill, uh, you'll see why like on sort of second order considerations, it actually winds up being a little bit the opposite, has been our experience.
yeah. And we like can probably end up talking a bit more about that as well later, about like the like the incentives that certain swaps give you, as opposed to like just the actual, there's like the impact of adding one specific card to your deck, and there's the impact on deck building of adding that specific card to your deck, and those are two different things. um but yeah, so we'll get into the sort of that stuff later, but we will start at the as is, and I completely forgot the quote. Oh well, we'll start at the start, at the beginning. um but yeah, so talking about specifically identifying sort of why you want a specific deck, or what factors are going to go into you thinking about what deck you want to play or what deck you want to build. um So I think I went through a couple of those already, and then um, I guess we can talk. Ooh, we didn't do a whole. I gotta be completely transparent. We did not do a whole lot of talking about how we were actually going to structure this conversation. We just sort of have a bunch of notes. Um, so I guess we can talk about. Yeah, you know what? Let's go in depth on this first point, and then we can sort of do that for each point afterward as well. Um, so in terms of sort of identifying what niche you want to deck for, again, I did go through a couple already, but basically how those affect what deck you're looking to choose and what deck you're looking to brew can sort of be fluid, and I think probably a good thing to remember about this step just in general is that you have to try to not have preconceived notions about specifically how certain commanders are supposed to work, and then also how certain strategies or certain cards are supposed to function, slash like what they actually um like what the end goal of playing those cards is, because you can sort of run into traps immediately at this stage of like writing off certain strategies, certain card packages, certain commanders, because they don't like necessarily like immediately line up with what you think your goals are for brewing a certain deck, and then you come to find out later that it's like, oh wait, I probably shouldn't have ruled those out. Like I might have been able to like make swaps or like change them around a bit, and then like have like basically like a deck that I didn't think was actually going to solve a lot of those problems, but actually ended up solving those problems. Example here for us is like, I think historically a lot of people have considered Hermit Druid to be a pretty fast all-in strategy, that operates for speed at the expense of card quality, and also, you know, like win con density, quote unquote win con density at expensive card quality, because you're turning all of your creature tutors into Hermit Druid tutors, which is a win. Um, but like that isn't actually what we were building for when we identified Hermit Druid. What we actually identified Hermit Druid as is like, you know, it's a one card win con in a deck that doesn't necessarily, or in like in a color combination, which is Timber Thrasios, that doesn't necessarily have good like one card win cons that are like that fast. And like, what does that mean for deck building? Well, it means that like you might actually be able to build a bit more mid-range, because it means that like you have this package that just lets you like win the game on command, so it means that you can just like change your deck a bit more. Anyway, I'm not going to get like too into the weeds on that one, but you know, like just not falling into the trap of like, I'm going to write off Hermit Druid for this like niche that I think I need a mid-range deck for, just because like Hermit Druid is like historically considered to be a fast strategy.
Yeah, I think like what about our approach sort of allows us to do that is that a lot of, and like this has happened in our discussions, is that we approach deck building in terms of like identifying a set of problems,
Mm-hmm.
and then when you start looking for solutions to those problems, you might sort of realize that, okay, here's a problem. In stalled out games, it's really hard to resolve demonic consultation, right? Like, just people have,
Yep.
a million dispels and fluster storms and whatever, and like people let value engines resolve because their interaction is like generally, more narrowly tuned to stopping win cons. And it's like, okay, well, how do we deal with that? Well, I mean, dispels and fluster storms don't counter Hermit Druid. They don't counter Sacred Guide. That means, is that something we can approach? And I think in the past we might have sort of said no, that doesn't really work, because particularly with Hermit Druid, the worst part of Hermit Druid, and I've said this several times, has always been Dread Return. And Dread Return's pretty easy to stop, but now, with the Malevolent Hermit, that was sort of what gave us the impetus to look at it again as like, can Hermit Druid work later in the game when people have the interaction based off the strength of the Malevolent Hermit, making it uncounterable? And then we sort of took that in a few different directions, and I believe even we went so far as read. Are you playing Hermit Druid, or is it Divining Witch in
I'm actually
your?
just on Divining Witch now,
Yeah,
basically
like
completely off the Hermit Druid package. Yeah.
but those types of cards, the cards that can, use an ability to exile your library,
Yeah.
are actually a pretty good solution to, say, like, metas where there might be a lot of things like rule of laws or deafening silence. So it's really hard to resolve your combo pieces when they're easy to counter, and it's even harder to defend them. Um, And so that was sort of the approach we were looking for, which is what brought us back to Hermit Druid.
Yeah, and I like it might be sort of like a difficult thing to get into like the headspace for if you like haven't done this sort of like thing before, but I think it's pretty productive if you are building toward a meta to potentially just like break down the sort of, you know, like what the factors of that like local meta, or like what factors are going into like making you build a certain deck, into a set of like identifiable problems that need solving, which is again like sort of how we tend to like just like internally like automatically conceptualize like how we need to build a deck for a meta, just because like having like distinct problems that you need to solve gives you like actual actionable things to work on for a brew, which I find is like gives you a lot more guidance and is a lot more useful than just like having some nebulous like, oh, okay, I need to solve stacks meta, so I'm going to build counter stacks deck. Like that's not super useful or like specific enough a lot of the time to get like good results consistently. So, you know, just like being a bit more breaking it down a bit more than that, and like giving yourself like actual things to work on for a deck, and like things to go back and check, versus like once I'm done brewing the deck, okay, let's go check like, did this actually solve all the problems that I needed it to solve?
Yeah, and I think this is where our sort of empirical approach really shines, because, you know, when you look at something like, okay, there's a lot of stacks, how do I solve that? You can sort of go off on a bunch of tangents, like, okay, what are the stacks? Well, you know, Winota's a really popular one. I need to deal with Winota. Okay, that is true, and, you know, that's especially if you're trying to play a longer game and you're, say, going to a tournament, you're going to encounter Winotas, and they might just run you over in the longer game. You do need answers to that, but, you know, now you're off on a bit of a rabbit hole on like focusing on a specific deck and not necessarily trying to solve, you know, a specific problem. You're solving a general problem, and when you play games against stacks, it's like, okay, I got run over by Winota, I'll put in some removal, I'll put in some, you know, if I can support the hate for it, like a Grafdigger's Cage or whatever, then great. But you can also then go, okay, you know, throughout this game, what was happening? Well, you know, I was drawing cards and I could assemble a win. I just didn't feel like it was going to resolve. Maybe because, you know, there's stacks effects like a deafening silence, and you know, this, I just don't think I can back things up. Okay, well, what are some other approaches to that problem, or like what are solutions to that problem? Okay, well, I could just put in a bunch of ways of destroying all the stacks effects, or I could, you know, tech myself to win through that in some other way, try and make my win cons resilient to various stacks effects. And those are problems like that just become a lot easier to identify when you play a bunch of games and you experience them.
Yeah, 100%. And just yeah, it's really just about like you're just going to encounter situations and like get to the root of problems much faster than like if you had conceptualized like, or like spent your time like exclusively conceptualizing around like how I need to solve this very broad problem. Um, which actually, this sort of like does dovetail a bit into the next part. I won't say it perfectly dovetails into it, but I'll make the segue work anyway. Which is along with the actual like what would be like maybe external factors for determining like what kind of deck you want to build, what deck like you need, and what problems you need to solve. Is also what kind of deck slash game slash strategy you're actually comfortable playing. This is a pretty huge one that is also can be a stopping block at some points for people who like are looking at this style of deck building, or just like looking at a style of deck building where they like want to solve problems, but the answers that like those problems lead you to solve them are maybe outside of your comfort zone by a pretty significant margin. You might be like a very, very heavy stacks player, and it might end up being that the realization that is that like you have a bunch of these problems that you need to solve, but the answer to those problems that you just play the fastest turbo deck in the format, which you might not be super comfortable with, right? So maybe like that's not actually a viable solution for you right now, and that you may need to like take another look at that and actually like evaluate, okay, maybe I'm not comfortable enough right now to play like a super fast turbo deck instead of my usual stack stuff. How about we take a look inside the sphere of like specifically stacks decks or stacks adjacent decks and like try to look for solutions within those bounds.
Yeah, yeah, and I think like this is an important factor, or something to consider is that even within archetypes there are a lot of variations, and you might think that like okay, I'm playing, I used Winota as an example earlier. I'm playing a stacks deck, and I'm just getting run over whenever I see Winota. I'm putting out my stacks pieces, they're putting out their stacks pieces. I'm putting out like whatever my commander is. I don't know, let's say you're playing like Timna Kodama, right? You're going, okay, I'm putting up my Timna, I'm putting up my Kodama, and then that's letting me, turn every permanent I play into a second permanent, so I'm basically putting out 2 things a turn. And Winota's just generating tokens and putting out 12 things a turn and just flattening me. What do I
Yeah.
do? Well, obviously you might say, okay, I'm gonna pick some like radically different deck. Um, I'm gonna go turbo. I'm gonna play Rog Silas, and like they're gonna be casting Winota, and I'm gonna be casting Adnaz in response, and they're gonna look like a fool or whatever. But even within stacks, you might go, okay, well, my problem is I'm being run over by Winota. There seems to be sort of 3 solutions to this. I need to make myself too big to be run over. I need to stop Winota from getting big enough to run me over, or I need to just end the game before they get that big. And, within those parameters, you could have, some other like giant combat deck. Like I'm not necessarily sold on Kamal, but like something like Jetmir can actually
Right.
put out a board that can just try and clock a Winota faster than they can clock you, or you could just tech yourself to have a bunch of removal, go for early Dranniths, whatever, to stop Winota from getting big, or you could look more in the direction of a deck like Blue Pod, where you say, yeah, sure, Winota's gonna on turn 5, Winota's gonna like slap me for 15 or whatever, and then I'm gonna untap and I'm gonna play Birthing Pod, and then I'm gonna combo kill them, and they're in Boros, so they're not gonna have anything to say about it. Um, and all of those are approaches that give you something to try and solve it without having to completely reinvent yourself as a player. Um, it is like, to be clear, I'm not saying never switch archetypes even if you're not comfortable with them. It really is going to depend on what your goals are. If you have a tournament that's say several months out and you really want to take it seriously and do the best you can, it might be worth it to try a different archetype and learn that. Obviously, if your tournament is in 2 weeks, that might not be as
Probably
realistic a
not as
goal.
sustainable of a solution, but
But yeah, there are definitely ways to. You can look for ways to solve problems within spaces, and even if they won't necessarily be the best way to solve a problem, they'll still, be at least partial solutions to those problems that you're encountering.
yeah, you'll end up better off than you were, even if it's not like a perfect solution. It's really just like not about like running into the stumbling block of like, oh, this is like these problems are pushing me in a direction that I like am not super comfortable in. I'm just gonna like not like handle them at all and just like continue playing what I'm comfortable with. Which is like I think that's like the failure case, right? Like the success case should be that like you're willing to change your deck, how you play your deck, change like what cards that you like are actually like interested in for certain situations, to solve problems, and doing that in like a way that like aligns with your current skill level with like any given strategy, at all. Uh, yeah, and then this like we have a last point here for this sub topic whatever, that I would say this is sort of like more of a ancillary point to the other two, but really it's this one is just like figuring out if your current deck actually, or like current deck, current strategy, what you're currently playing actually aligns with the criteria for building your new list. There's like this shortcut that you can take a lot of the time is that even if you are comfortable in a lot of strategies, just being like, oh, like I've been playing this current deck for like a really long time, and I think that like it solves a lot of the problems, and like maybe I can just like make card changes, and like with like 5 to like 10 card changes, I can like solve all these problems. Um, just being aware that like, well, yes, that can happen sometimes, particularly with like higher color decks where you have access to the entire card pool. Don't necessarily like don't get super caught up on like trying to play the deck that you think is really good right now and then also solve those problems with that deck. Just, again, be open to like just having to play a different deck, playing different commanders, swapping even just like minor strategies, like maybe swapping your win conditions, specifically for like that kind of like for like the stacks building. Cool. So those are that I think that covers for the most part, unless Morgan, I'm forgetting something, like most of like the motivation or like what actually gets you to a deck to start building in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary of sort of how we of the factors that led us to settling on Hermit Druid, um, in
Yeah,
terms of our approach.
yeah. And I guess if we want to like recap like how this applies specifically to like Hermitage if we were talking about it. Um yeah, so that one ended up being like in a commander pairing that is well within our comfort zone. Thrasios Timna is probably it's almost certainly my most played commander. I'm guessing it's probably up there for Morgan as well. Like I don't know how much you've played cats over the years, but I feel
It's
like
up
it's
there.
probably up
I've
there.
played a decent
Yeah.
amount of Thrasios Team now for
Yeah.
sure.
So well within comfort zone. But we had sort of dropped it for a while for other stuff, and that other stuff was like Thrasios Timna Turbo stuff, or like Morgan had played a bit of Blue Pod, like just played some other commander and like 5-color pairings and stuff. And we realized that we needed to solve problems having to do with stacks and having a good mid-range game. And hey, would you look at that? Thrastimna is like really good at busting mid-range games wide open and sort of has a really high floor versus stacks. So that's why we went with that. And then obviously we had problems with, winning through counter magic, winning through stacks, winning quickly, all of which Hermit Druid helped out with. So once you actually have a deck in mind, and maybe you've like put together the initial list, or like you've taken a list from wherever, from the database, from a deck server, you stole a list from a friend, you've played it a bit. This is sort of like what I would say is the real meat and potatoes of sort of brewing decks, for like brewing like real decks, or like we need to have come up with a better term for this before starting this episode, because it's like it's not tournament deck specifically, but it's also not like just your run of the mill brew. Anyway,
I
we'll
didn't
we'll
use
call
a
them
lot of
like,
these techniques. I
yeah,
didn't use nearly as formally when I was brewing Kayla, for example.
yeah, exactly. I okay, we'll shortcutting to call them real decks, but by real decks,
I think Sirius is probably a better.
serious. Okay, we'll call them serious decks. Yeah, you know what? Serious is fine. I'll lock that one in.
Because
Um,
like the key is not, I feel like real is often used as like a straight signifier of power level, and like that's
yeah,
not
yeah,
what
yeah,
we're
exactly.
talking about here.
That
We're
was the
talking
concern.
about
That's not at all. It's like, yeah,
decks that you are trying to make as good as you can make them, and it doesn't actually matter how good that is to apply
yeah,
these techniques.
exactly. So yeah, getting into the real meat and potatoes of brewing serious decks, which is tuning. So obviously, I mean, the precursor to this is so like any of these strategies that we're going to go over, any of these things that we're going to go over, is that you really just have to be playing a lot of games with a deck with a serious brew. There's not really any way around that. Obviously, like if you're a very strong theoretical deck builder, you can bypass a bit of that if you're like very familiar with the archetype and you have like a very good idea of like how all these packages interact and stuff. But that I feel like that is going to be a very narrow case of like you have an insane amount of theoretical rigor and a ton of experience building this deck that also happens to solve all of the problems that you need solving, and you haven't already been building this deck. Very narrow. So endpoint is basically you're gonna have to play a lot of games, and you're gonna have to get like a lot of experience in to like actually understand what what the outcomes of these upcoming strategies are for that tuning.
Yeah, I think
But
you
yeah,
can
so we'll
also
just
goldfish. You can goldfish for certain types of information. I think
yeah,
people like often sort of make the mistake of trying to goldfish. Like if you're just goldfishing a deck that isn't like a pure turbo deck, and you're just trying to figure out how fast is it. If you just try and get a sense of like, does this deck feel good when it's a relatively flexible deck, you're not gonna sort of find that, because I think it's hard to evaluate how good it feels to play like your Timna into some value engine into whatever, and you're winning
yeah,
on turn 6, but you had 4 pieces of interaction and what stacks. But there are things you can goldfish for. Speed is like the most obvious one. Um,
yep.
but there are
Win con density
also,
is another huge one.
yeah, win con
Just like
density.
how often do you have access to your win by like the third turn?
Yeah, and like you can also sort of goldfish, uh, kind of like against a specific deck in a way. Like you could sort of goldfish with an eye to, okay, let's pretend there was a Winota deck in this pod. Like, is the way I'm playing this game actually conducive to me winning that pod, right? Like, if
Yeah.
I'm winning slowly, if I'm gonna be hit hard by like any stacks piece, maybe not. But I think there's no substitute for just getting games against mixed opponents. But there is utility in gold fishing, even if it's not general utility. It's more specific.
Yeah. I think probably a good descriptor for this is like the base here is that you need to play as many games as possible. And then there are various ways to shortcut parts of that and to like acquire that information in possibly more time and effort efficient ways. But the base case is really, if you're having any problems or if you need more information, is just to play more games. And just like accrue that information naturally.
And if you can find people who are willing to play specific things against you, that can
Yeah,
uh,
that one
be
too.
be very valuable. Obviously, like some people, like you don't just have a team of people whose job it is to make your testing as impactful as
Yeah.
possible. But it's if you can, even if you just know someone who like plays a deck, you're like, okay, I haven't played it, I don't play against very much turbo, so like I'm gonna go look for games online, and I'm gonna invite a friend who like I know plays turbo to play some games. You
Or
can
you can go
definitely
like
get.
even levels deeper than that and be like orchestrate pods between people that you know play specific decks, right? Like be like, okay, like this Saturday I'm gonna like, or like I'm gonna DM people and be like, okay, like I have this block of time on Saturday, like can you guys play in this pod just so I can get like specific testing for that.
Or do
Um
what we did. Get a second person
yeah.
who also wants to tune the same deck,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then
I
one
was
of you
about to
can play
say.
the thing you want to play against, because they're still getting useful information.
Exactly. Which actually that actually does help a lot in terms of like if you have a bunch of different people that are all looking to optimize the same deck, you can sort of like basically turn that into a team as long as you all like trust each other's evaluation and opinion and stuff, because like you can, you have a pod full of people that are all looking to optimize the same deck. You have one person playing that deck, everybody else plays like the optimal testing pod for that you need the information for, and then you have like an in-depth breakdown of the game after the fact and like what worked, what didn't. Um but yeah, it really, yeah, it's just playing games. um cool. So yeah, we'll go into like sort of the strategies that we use when tuning, and just sort of like talk through some of them and some examples, particularly having to do with Hermit Druid, and then like maybe some broader stuff for some of them. The first one that we have here is probably, I think, the first step that we go to. Honestly, I start doing this even before I played games necessarily. I do like a bit of gold fishing, then go in and like check this immediately, which is just identifying effects that are in the deck that you started with. So again, wherever that came from, a friend, the database, a decklist server, just online in general. Identifying effects that are in that deck that you don't actually think that you need. Um, so like a very specific example is for playing Hermit Druid. Typically, a lot of Hermit Druid decks have historically had both Narcomoeba and a Fate Stitcher in it, or Dredgescape zombie, for having two bodies that come back from the graveyard in order to cast a Dread Return, along with having the Hermit Druid in play. Um, and for us, we almost always felt that we didn't actually need the second body. We like almost always had a Dork or a Thrasios out, which meant that we only really needed the Narcomoeba. So like we basically immediately cut the Fate Stitcher out of the deck, because it was just something that we identified as it's in the decks a lot. It's a default include. It's a default include for a reason, but we didn't think that we really needed it for what we needed the deck for.
Yeah, and if you look at sort of, I think as we've sort of stated, we were tending on taking this deck a little bit more mid-range. You'll realize that, like, the situation where you need that second graveyard body is when you don't already have a creature in play, you don't have 3 mana to to disturb your hermit, your Malevolent Hermit, and you have a Hermit Druid activation. And those are like, that's a very narrow set of requirements, because if you're, say, getting a Hermit Druid out on turn 1 or turn 2, and you don't have another creature in hand, like, how are you doing that? I mean, like, maybe you just naturally had it off of, like, a Lotus Petal.
Yeah.
But that's, like, maybe you just don't play that hand that way.
Yeah, like,
and if you're
like,
if you're finding
you
it off
might
like Crypt Green Sun Zenith, then you're gonna have the mana to disturb the Malevolent Hermit, and if
the
you're
Hermit,
finding,
or just cast Thrasios,
or just
or
cast
whatever, right?
Thrasios,
Like,
if you have
yeah,
if you have 3 colored mana, then like 1 to activate Hermit, 2 to cast Thrasios, that does it. And so like all of these things, we sort of went like, it's a very narrow situation where we don't have like any one of these potential solutions to that problem, and we need that second graveyard body. And so that's, we decided we could cut it. And there have been a couple games where I wished I had it, but there have also, having played decks
yeah,
with cards like that in them, there would have been a lot more games, and with the other combo pieces in the deck, like, there have been a lot more games where I've been cursing myself for drawing Narcomoeba and Dread Return and Memory's Journey,
yeah,
than there
exactly.
have games where it's like, man, I really wish I had another one of these cards in my deck.
Yeah, it's and this one, yeah, this is definitely like I think that example case might be like a bit hard to grasp at first blush, just as well, because like it's there's we come from a time of slot efficiency was a huge deal for a lot of decks, particularly for something like Hulk, and the Hulk packages also sort of like bleed over into Hermit Druid packages, in terms of like there's sort of these variable sized win con packages that like give you a non-linear, they get like a non-linear amount better the larger the packages get, but the larger packages also decrease your card quality. um it can be a bit hard to conceptualize, and especially to evaluate correctly for those cards, but just remember that this point also applies to like just like a ton of other stuff. Like, okay, this deck's playing like 5 separate win cons. I don't think I need all 5 separate win cons. I think I can probably cut one of the win cons. Do I really need Kitten Basalt in this deck with Isochron Scepter, Anthorical Consult, like, and like Mnemonic Betrayal and a Praetor's Grasp package, and like reanimation too? It's like, okay, do I need all of these? No, I can cut one of them. It applies to like a lot of different cases.
Yeah, and I think that's also like something that sort of shifts as you play a deck, is you realize which win cons you're like leaning on and which ones you're maybe not using as much. Like, when you start with a Hermit Druid deck, you're like, yeah, the primary game plan is Hermit Druid, and like, is Hermit Druid activate, Dread Return, Mythorical, win. And then you start to
Yeah.
realize it's like, okay, maybe that's not the primary plan. Maybe the primary plan is actually like activating Hermit Druid after getting Thoracle into play some other way, just because it's a lot less risky.
It's an uncounterable
Or
consult,
like
yeah.
I'm gonna be spending a lot of time you know like going for consults some other way, either with consult, either by activating the Hermit Druid, either by or using something like a Sacred Guide or a Divining Witch if you're playing it. And then you can sort of realize, okay, maybe if this is actually not the primary plan, can I afford to start trimming some of the pieces for that? So like the second Hermit Druid, or the second Graveyard Body, was like relatively easy. I've been considering, even while keeping like the Dread Return, Malevolent Hermit stuff, I have been considering just cutting the Memory's Journey.
Yeah.
Because I'm not, like, the times when I'm going for the quote unquote risky line of activating Hermit Druid to get Oracle out of my graveyard, I'm like not feeling particularly like I'm not gonna be doing that, when I think there's like a bunch of interaction and it might just go horribly wrong. I'm gonna be looking for like safer wins in cases like that. So, maybe I can just not play the Memory's Journey, so then I don't have to worry about drawing it, and I can still sometimes, get the value out of the Dread Return and the Hermit Druid as a
just
one card
like
win
get people.
con. If everyone's like more or less hellbent, then like having Hermit Druid as a one card win con might still be valuable,
Is still very valuable. Yeah.
but you don't need the protection as much. And that's like that's sort of illustrating how as my perceptions of the deck changed as I played it and which win cons I was focusing on, it felt like I was maybe freeing up some slots that historically like have been auto includes or staples of the genre.
Things that you like would not consider cutting at all. It is actually sort of funny as well though that I think you're considering cutting Mem Journey and just keeping the Dread Return, which I think is like totally fine, by the way. But it's also funny that Shaper has actually gone the entirely different direction, which is just cutting the Dread Return and only playing Hermit Druid, Mem Journey, and a Thoracle. Just so upkeep, activate Hermit Druid, put the Thoracle back on top, draw into it, cast it, etc. But like same sort of idea, right? Like same sort of stuff. Just like cutting cards that like you previously had thought are just like staples and like uncuttables because of like lived play experience with the deck, and being like, okay, like this stuff isn't actually as necessary as I might have like first thought. And sort of like in a pair with that point is the next point, which I think I forget where I first heard of it. I'll read this out for. Sorry, I have a really bad habit of like getting into the backstory behind something before reading it out. So this point is identifying effects that you wish that you had access to in a deck, first, and then figuring out what cards actually have that effect and can fill in the slot, and whether or not they're good enough. Like the best card in that effect is good enough to actually include in the deck. I forget where I heard about this concept. It might have even been in my Yu-Gi-Oh days at one point, where like sort of I learned about like how to conceptualize this way of building decks. But the idea is that like you basically in your mind you've played some number of games with a deck, and you're like, man, I really wish that there was a card that did X in the deck. I really wish that there was a card that let me like remove like 3 creatures at once. And I still want to keep my board, but like I wish I could like kill like an opposing like player's board at like just like a decent mana cost in an accessible way. And like solidifying that want for that effect in your mind, and then using that, going through like Scryfall or searching through like a card database and trying to find cards that like roughly approximate that effect, because you're like almost never going to find a card that like actually does the exact thing that you want. Obviously, like either it doesn't exist or it's probably banned. Oh my god, I want like 3 mana for free. Well, yeah, it's Black Lotus is banned for a reason. But you can find cards that are like analogous to that effect. I think like a great example here is like the after playing just regular Thrasios Tymna Hermit Druid for a while, the thought that kept popping up in my head, and I'm sure Morgan, it was for you as well, but I can only really speak to my experience here, which is that I kept getting this thought in my head of like, man, I really wish that I could just get a Hermit Druid with haste. I just like really want a creature that I could tutor that like does the Hermit Druid thing. Um, but I don't want to like have to like play an extra card. Like I don't want to play Lightning Greaves because like they're fine, but they have anti-synergy and with like an oof, and like I have to like actually find them before doing a Hermit Druid thing to actually have a hasty Hermit. I wish I just like had a Hermit Druid that didn't have to tap to activate. Um,
And
and
also, like, historically, you spent a little while trying to solve that problem by
yeah,
getting the next best thing, which was a Hermit Druid with Flash.
yeah, exactly. Like I've tried a lot to like work through. Yeah, this is for the record, major reoccurring problem in my brewing of Hermit Druid. For a long time, it was doing stuff like playing like going really far into instant speed stuff. So playing like obviously Court of Calling, but also like Aether Vial, Emergent Zone, Vivian Champion of the Wild, or whatever it is, the 3-mana Vivian that gives creatures spells flash. Like just like that kind of stuff to try to like sneak a Hermit Druid in an end step, so that like it like sort of has haste. The other way that I went about this as well was like I played with like Breakfast for a long time. Breakfast is like sort of a hasty Hermit Druid. I really didn't like that combo that much. I tried with Lightning Greaves. Lightning Greaves was like sort of awkward and it like didn't really do the thing that I wanted to that much. I tried with actually Swift Reclamation plus Devoted Druid for a bit, because Swift Rec can actually give a Hermit Druid haste because it turns it into a not creature that can activate, and then also layers with Devoted Druid. So like I tried a lot of solutions to this problem, and it ended up being that like really what I was actually looking for wasn't necessarily like a Hermit Druid with haste, or like I okay, if they printed a Hermit Druid with haste tomorrow, yes, obviously I'd play it. But really what the answer wasn't that I wanted a Hermit Druid with haste, it was that I wanted a Demonic Consultation with haste slash a Demonic Consultation on legs, which ended up being Sacred Guide, right? Sacred Guide is very much a consult on legs with, I mean, obviously you have some deck building restrictions there, but the idea is that it fills this niche of like, man, I really wish I had like something that like a body in this deck that could empty my library on the same turn that it gets played. And Sacred Guide fits that very nicely. But it's really just about like, again, this is one of those things where it's like identifying a problem in quotes. This is like sort of a looser definition of a problem, I guess, but like identifying like sort of what the issue is, what you want, and then afterward going in and like sort of backfilling that problem or finding a solution to that problem with the existing card pool.
Yeah, and it's interesting that that also kind of parallels the original development of Sacred Hulk, right? Where it was like,
Yeah,
okay,
exactly.
Ladman seems like a good card that just kind of wins the game pretty easily on its own. And I want to play Flash Hulk because that combo's dumb, but I don't want to play like a 7-card Flash Hulk package. You know, I want to be immune to like graveyard removal. Like I don't want to, you know, have to worry about things like Deathrite Shaman. Um, and that was, you know, like a lot of those factors are actually somewhat like they're not exactly the same, but they're somewhat similar
Yeah.
to some of the factors that influenced our brew of Sacred Hermit.
Yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, Morgan, I don't know actually how much you use this like sort of mental model, but it is like I will say this is like one of the ones that I like absolutely subconsciously use the most, in terms of brewing decks is like, or like is the most recognizable to me of like figuring out the like your like dream effect ahead of time, and then like figuring out how to make that work with the card pool.
I definitely like I have sometimes done that. Generally for me, that happens a little bit more in like the deck selection phase where it's like I want
Right.
a deck that can, you know, do this and, you know, has, you know, like I want a deck that can win in one turn, you know, through like these types of effects or, you know, with these types of cards. I'm
Right.
less like, oh, in playing this deck I want this very specific type of effect. But yeah, it's
Gotcha.
definitely like it does happen.
Yeah. Um, cool. Uh, Next up, there is another point here, which is identifying problems or weaknesses in your list, and then how to shore them up with swaps. This is like very closely related to the previous point slash concept, but is like very much its own thing. Morgan, I know you had like specifically stuff to say about this.
Yes. So this was like we spent a lot of time sort of going, okay, how do we deal with um I mean, we put it very specifically, which was how do we deal with Crom installed games? But
Yeah,
like it wasn't just that. It was sort of like,
yeah, it's a
okay,
more broad problem.
how, assuming we can't just get in with Timna over and over again, and creatures are piling up on the board, how can we deal with this? And like we've been playing Cyclonic Rift the whole time, but that's one card, and often it can be quite difficult to resolve because people who have spent a lot of time piling all these creatures onto the board tend to not want to let you bounce them all. Um, and so we were looking for solutions, and we tried like some kind of interesting stuff. We tried a couple like niche removal spells. I know
I think
Reed
March
tried,
of Swirling Mist came out of that
yeah, March. You
experimentation.
tried Grim Hireling, and that was
Yep.
like, we're thinking, oh well, we can use it to like deal with problematic effects, but it wasn't a perfect solution because the problem we were trying to solve was that we couldn't get in effectively.
Couldn't get in,
And
which like
it's
sort of
like, okay, you still
neutralizes Grim
can't get in.
Harling.
And then like this, this was a problem where we didn't. I wouldn't necessarily say like we solved it. It's still an issue.
Yeah.
But we like the most effective thing we found was actually the Wingcrafter, which
Yeah.
sounds like it. It doesn't solve the problem on its face, but it sort of softens the problem a little bit, where it's like, okay, now we can maintain our card advantage and our card draw. You can also, this was a mode that we actually didn't initially consider with Wingcrafter, but wound up becoming relevant at a few different points. Is that when you just have a bunch of creatures in hand, you can use the Wingcrafter to like turn each of them into a flying chump blocker. Like if a Crom
Yeah,
is
which is
beating you down, you go like,
super
cool, I'll
useful.
play Findhorn Elves, I'll swing in with Wingcrafter, draw my card with Timna, and then I'll get attacked by Crom, block with the Findhorn Elves, play another creature bonded to the Wingcrafter, and repeat.
Yep.
Which like can buy you enough time and card advantage to come up with like to find one of your more permanent solutions. And it's just kind of an interesting between the ways we felt we could just still win through those stalled board states with just play out a Sacred Guide and then try and get a Thoracle into play and activate it and dodge a
Yeah.
lot of interaction, plus a card like Wingcrafter, which can help you maintain card advantage and give you some blockers and buy you some time. um we found like a few partial solutions sort of working together to mitigate that problem.
Yeah. Like again, it's the identifying of problems is like super critical to at least the way that we optimize decks and like brew decks and tune decks. But the like very important thing to remember, sort of like the kernel of wisdom to take out of this, is that like a lot of the time the problem, like the solutions to those problems aren't single cards. It's not like single deck building choices. It's not like single play pattern choices. It's like the interaction of a bunch of different things a lot of the time, as well as just the fact that like maybe this deck doesn't actually particularly solve that problem like particularly efficiently. Maybe like you actually, in order to like completely solve that problem for the deck that you're building, like you actually just have to change out like 10 slots. Like I just need to play like 10 pieces of increasingly bad mass removal to actually like totally solve that problem. So we're gonna look for like a workaround or a mitigator instead. Cool. There's also I have a couple more here. I was actually a pretty big fan of this next point, which is sort of identifying trade-offs for certain inclusions in a deck. I think this is a really good practice to get into when I think a lot of the time you can sort of if you've been working on a deck for a long time, you can get lazy with evaluation for certain cards, and you can sort of like you end up like sort of like dropping some internal reasoning for cards over time, as like if you've been playing with them for a really long time, you sort of end up like just subconsciously working them into your brain as like, yeah, this is just like part of the deck because it does like X specific thing, and sort of forgetting the initial reason why you put it into the deck was because yes, it does X specific thing, but it also does X, X, and X. And uh like it those reasons sort of get lost, and that contributes to issues where you are also forgetting about what you're not playing in order to include that card, or like what you're missing out on for playing that card. To give a very a very I'd say like illustrative example, although like I don't think this is going to be the case for like almost any other card, is specifically putting Sacred Guide in a deck. Super obvious case of trade-offs here, right? When you have a Sacred Guide in your deck, you have a creature tutorable consult that can happen the same turn. You're also not playing any other white cards. They're like very clear trade-offs, right? You have like this very high win con density, or like this piece that increases your win con density by a bunch, but you're also losing a bunch of these good cards, and you can like directly weigh those. But this also does apply to stuff like we were talking about earlier, extensive Hermit Druid packages. So you end up with trade-offs with like Hermit Druid packages where it's, again, how many dead cards am I willing to run for like these marginal upsides, or like just the dead cards for making specifically Hermit Druid a better card in your deck. So like how many trade-offs are you willing to make there? Or even more broadly than talking about specific packages, talking about like maybe a mid-range deck, or sorry, a mid-range package in a deck like Blue Pod. Like, okay, how many slots am I willing to dedicate for this mid-range package? Because every slot that I dedicate to the mid-range package is like, it's reducing my speed, or it's reducing the
interaction
ability for me to find my combos. It's reducing my ability to protect my combos, etc., etc. They're like, when you're including a card in a deck, that's a slot that you could have used for something else, and there are inherent trade-offs there that you have to think about. And it obviously, like, as sort of I just went through, that runs the gambit from specific cards introducing trade-offs because they have downsides, to all the way up to like, how large do specific packages in my deck have to be to not like overlap, or like to actually do the job that I need them to do, like consistently, while also allowing me to do all the other stuff that I need to do.
I think maybe, like, obviously Sacred Guide is the most extreme example you're going to find. Or second most extreme. I think Polymorph is the most extreme. But but like, I think they're, looking at some other decks might provide sort of more generally applicable examples. A big one is like secondary win conditions in a deck like Razakats. People have tried Bomberman because you're already playing the Lion's Eye Diamond, so then the obvious inclusion of Aureox Salvagers is only one extra slot, which is obvious, which is good. But it's a somewhat risky combo. People have looked at things like Swift Druid or Kinnan Basalt, and then it gets into a bit of an awkward question of, Collector Roof. Like, how aggressively are you finding it? Are you potentially playing other versions of that effect? And this was another thing, going back to the example reused of Blue Pod, where I know some people have wanted to not play Artifact Hate because obviously it's a bit of a nombo with Birthing Pod.
It is a pod deck.
But like, in my list, I went, okay, I'm gonna play Vanifar, which makes me feel a little bit more free to play this. Plus, do you also try and include an Emiel combo that doesn't require artifact activations? Like, Emiel Dockside is in the deck, but do you play,
Emiel Feldar Gaia's Cradle?
Yeah, like, are you looking to set up things like that? How do you build the deck? And it felt like I did have to. There were slots I felt like I needed to include in order to support a Collector Roof in this deck that fundamentally, relied on
pod, at least for part of its wins, and like pod type combos for most of its wins. And
Yeah.
that did involve costs. And I also tried, like, okay, can I without running like actual literal collector for Stony Silence or No Rod, can I deal with artifacts, somewhat effectively? And like I tried Root Maze, I tried Meltdown, um, and like those also carried their own costs. Melting, playing Meltdown and then trying to play Dockside,
Yeah,
kind of a bit
not a great
silly.
combo.
Like Root Maze just is like a very difficult effect to just be comfortable
Break
playing
on.
under
Yeah.
in the early game, which is when you really want it.
Blind Obedience is nice, but maybe not particularly not quite powerful enough to actually do the job that you needed to do.
Yeah, so like you do have to I think like a case where considering trade-offs is going to be really relevant is when you're looking at what kind of hate you're playing.
Yeah, 100%. It's also like, I mean, even like even outside of like the collector of fate stuff, this is like very much the case for like rule of laws as well. It's like, okay, like obviously rule of laws come with a drawback, but like, can I mitigate those? Like, do my win cons work under the rule of law? Like, what do I actually have to take out of the deck and like again backfill to make it actually like function under rule of law? Or again, any kind of that stuff. It's just like it's always a game of trade-offs. And you like if you can't if you can't find the trade-off for a card going into your deck, you probably have to look a bit deeper at it. Because there almost certainly is a trade-off somewhere. It might be at the level of like just taking up a bit of space for an effect that you don't need as much, which is certainly still a trade-off, just a bit more abstract. But there is probably going to be one there. And then finally, probably my favorite part of the deck tuning process, even though the results of it are not my favorite, which is just doing like multiple rounds of aggressive cutting for a deck.
Really loves cutting cards.
I love cutting cards. I'm addicted to cutting cards from decks. I love looking at a deck and being like, yeah, I could get this down to 85 cards, even though it looks incredibly tight. My issue is that once I make those cuts, it's incredibly annoying to backfill, and usually ends up re-including some of the cut cards, just to make space again. But really, like, I'm not going to tell anybody listening to this podcast that you need to cut cards with the same vigor that I do. But it's a very, very good idea to I like when it gets like really in depth into the weeds, like when we're doing testing for like a larger tournament or like going through a really intense refinement cycle for a deck. We'll be playing like maybe like 3 or 4 nights out of a week, like playing a couple of games of CDH with a testing group, and then like afterwards, like after every session, I'll just like go through the deck and be like, okay, these are like the 5 cards that I don't really think are good in the deck right now, and here are like the 5 other like flex slots that like could be added to the watch list later. And like if I cut these 5 cards right now, what would I put back in for them? Do I have slots that I put back in for them? Do I have like cards that like solve problems that, or like do I like want to test cards that I think solve problems that I think need solving in the deck right now? But just like going through and like aggressively like in your mind being like, okay, I think these 5 cards are probably on the cutting room floor right now. They might not ever make their way out of the deck, but like I'm feeling like I want to cut those cards after this session, and like maybe test cutting those cards, putting in other stuff for them, and just like sort of just aggressively pruning decks at some point in the testing process, because it's very easy to end up with just slots in your deck that are locked just because they've like the cards have been in your deck for that long and they don't actually make you feel strongly one way or another. It's like, okay, like this, I'm never happy to see this card, but I'm never like unhappy to see this card. Like, does that ever like actually register on a level when you're looking at it without the immediate experience of just having like played 3 games of it? Yeah, probably not. So like, just like getting to a point where you're happy to be like, I'm just gonna drop a bunch of cards from this list, see how it feels without them, and then like I'll put them back if it ends up being bad without them. Just like making sure that you actually get to the point where you are cutting cards.
Yeah, it's definitely like it may sort of seem like if you cut cards and then put them back in, that you haven't actually accomplished anything, and from like a fully external sense you haven't, but knowing that they are cuttable is actually very valuable.
And knowing that you have cut them and felt bad about cutting them and like strengthened your reasoning for having had them in the deck is also very valuable.
Yeah, and like I feel like probably we shouldn't be doing this as close to tournaments as we wind up doing it, but
Yeah.
every time shortly before a tournament we'll like sit down across the table from each other and we'll lay out like 4 cards and go, okay, which 2 of these do you think I should play? Like that's sort of, you know, the like the final step is, you know, I'm looking at like I've got my Dispel and my Priest of Titania on the table, and I'm like, okay, which one of these am I playing? Or
actually, recently it's like it's Priest of Titania, Dispel, Survival of the Fittest, and Notion Thief, and it's like, okay, what of these 4 are going in the deck?
And like just knowing, you know, that like you know, I mean, I think it's important. One of the things that illustrates is we're not looking at like slot for slot swaps, right? Like, it's not like,
that's actually a huge one.
Dispel or Miscast, or even like, do I play Dispel or Nature's Claim? You know, we're looking at like much like cross purpose swaps, or cross purpose slots, because they're not really swaps.
This is actually a huge thing, and like thank you for reminding me, because I feel like I've been talking about this sort of like on and off for like literal months, or it's been like sitting like rent free in my brain for like probably years at this point. But a large part of building decks is also like once you get the general composition of a deck down in terms of like, you know, what percentage of the deck is like feels good to be win cons or dedicated to like win con slots, what percentage of the deck feels right to you to have like the right amount of like interaction, right amount of removal, right amount of counter magic, right amount of value pieces, etc., etc. Once you get like the rough ratios down, a lot of tuning decks is not at all about like, okay, do I think like Dispel or Miscast is better here? Obviously, like those come up, and it's like good to like have an understanding of like what specific like same role card swaps you're happy with and you think are good in a deck. But a lot more of the time, it's not like one for one swaps in terms of like, okay, what piece of counter magic is best for the slot? It's what card is best for the slot, because like we're evaluating this on like effects that I want once I already have a good like functional ratio of all of the different things that I like, the default things that I want going on in this deck. I just want to get that out there because it annoys me when specifically, and I'm sorry if you're listening to this and have ever asked me this question. I promise I don't hate you. It just the act of it happening is annoying to me, which is when people are like, oh, so I see that you cut like Miscast from this deck, so what did you put in for it? In like, maybe I made like 3 swaps to a deck. I cut like a Dispel and 2 stacks pieces and put in like a value piece and like a win condition piece and like a different piece of interaction. They're like, oh, so you did like a 1-for-1 swap of like that Dispel for that piece of interaction. And I was like, no, I cut the 3 cards in the deck that I felt bad about and like felt really bad, and I put in 3 cards that I wanted to play.
Yeah, you know, there are occasional times where it might be useful to acknowledge, like, I think when we wound up cutting Nature's Claim, it wasn't like we swapped it for Force of Vigor, but it was like with the printing of Boseiju and our decision that we wanted to include Force of Vigor, you know, it's like, okay, now it feels like we have the density of this effect, and, you know, then shortly after we cut Nature's Claim, like, it actually wasn't even a direct 1-for-1 swap.
It wasn't. It was there, like, all 3 of those were in the deck for a very, like, decent period of time and before, we made the decision
we have
to
more
be
of
like,
this effect than we need. Which one do we
what's
like
what's
least?
The worst version of this effect? Which very well, if Force of Vigor or Boseiju were worse cards, could have been one of them, but it in fact ended up being the Nature's Claim.
Yeah, and I think that's like, it's an important trap to avoid falling into, of just viewing everything as straight swaps and overly, a related trap is just overly locking yourself into ratios.
Yeah,
You can
especially because like the quote-unquote optimal ratios in a deck completely change with both play pattern and meta, right? Like
absolutely.
if you're playing against alt stacks, like you're obviously gonna have to cut down on counter magic to some degree, and probably either go up on like win condition density, removal, or value pieces.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think that's actually pretty much all we had for the main topic laid out. Which is hilarious to say it because I think me and Morgan could probably go on talking about if not deck building methodology or tuning methodology, at least talking about Sacred Druid or just like Thrasios Timna shells for like literal hours, but I think we have to cut it off somewhere. So I think ending points, summarizing points. We didn't write any of this down, but let's try to come up with a neat bow for this main topic. I think just in general, trying to remember that like pretty much every card in a deck is cuttable to some degree or not. It just like the situations in which they are cuttable get more and more convoluted and require like more things to happen in specific ways for you to actually like be able to cut them. Obviously, I'm not expecting people to cut like Soul Rings and Mana Crypts from their deck or cut Rhystic Study from your deck, obviously. But just
oh no, 42,
having
42 thread incoming.
But just like having the option in your head to like recognizing that those cards are good and that they should be in your deck, but also recognizing that like there's nothing stopping you from cutting basically anything in your deck. It's your deck. You should build it as you like. Just having like really good really good reasons for basically all the cards that are in your list. I think probably a really great place to be is if you can look at your like main serious deck, look at it and like literally justify every single card in the deck. I'm not saying that you should like be doing that as like a check like every time you finish a revision of the deck to go through and like justify every card to yourself. I'm just saying that like you should feel pretty comfortable about explaining exactly like how your interaction suite is composed, exactly why you're playing like these win conditions and not these win conditions, these like tutors that like find your stuff and what they don't find, and like all your like various like small little tech pieces. And if that explanation is, well, I just like it, then that's fine, but like maybe you should do like a bit more thinking on like why you're playing that card and like potentially if you can make space with it.
For sure.
Morgan, do you have a good moral of the story at the end here? Clean it up.
I mean, I guess you just gotta be careful and make sure not to get too attached to your sacred cows.
Which is great because I might spoil that depending on what the title to this episode was, but we'll leave it there. Cool beans. We are unfortunately, I think this might be like the first time that we've skipped it in a long time anyway. Episode full first today. I think we're gonna pass on gut check today. It's not particularly interesting with two people. Although
getting
I'm
off the cuff answer.
Yeah. I'm sure we could have come up with a replacement, but we'll try to funnel that one into our listener question. Which we do have today. A reminder that if you would like a question and answer on the show, we have a channel on our Discord that you can go to, the listener questions no discussion channel, and just submit a listener question. We might end up answering it on the pod. But this one is from Emsmax. This question is, if Stifle cost Phyrexian blue instead of blue, how many decks would play it? It's an interesting one, huh?
I tend to think it would go in a lot of decks.
Yeah.
So I think it would go in decks that would make it quite a strong piece of interaction. Particularly, it would be very appealing for turbo decks, because it allows.
Oh, really?
Well, sorry, maybe not turbo. It would be very appealing for decks that want to be aggressively developing their own game plan. maybe not exactly winning, but like more free interaction just makes tapping out that much safer.
Right. I was more thinking though that like it's more like for control decks in a way that like, or like control and mid-range decks, and it's less, for me it's less about like decks that are already tapping out and more of like an inclusion that would give you more license to tap out in those decks that are already like being interactive and
sorry,
just trying to stop people
I
from
think
winning.
I'll revise. I should not have said turbo decks. Because that,
Sure.
but yeah, decks that are looking to very proactively tap out in the early game, especially because it's like generally pretty flexible against like the two biggest effects that are gonna kill you out of nowhere are Oracle and Dockside. Right, where it's like, you know, when someone goes turn one, you know, land, crypt, rock, Imperial Seal, like, okay, yeah, we might just be getting nosed next turn or whatever it is. But when someone has like a bit of a slower start, the two sort of easiest ways of going from, you know, maybe 3 or 4 mana to killing you are either just Oracle consulting you or playing Dockside into playing something really expensive, and it gives you an answer to both of those, that like lets you not have to worry so much about holding up interaction to stop those, especially because like Dockside is a creature, which means most of the counter magic that hits it is not even 1 mana, it's 2 mana.
Yeah.
Which is
or 0, but
well,
yeah.
I mean, force will hits it. Presumably, you're not pacting like super early.
Hey man, you never know.
Yeah.
Dude, you have because you have Phyrexian Stifle now, so you can pact it and then stifle your pack trigger. The actual free counter magic. That's actually just like forcible with extra steps. You're spending 2 cards at 0 mana. You're spending 2 life.
Oh my god, I'm just now picturing like every time you have a pact that you can't pay for, you just have to ask if the table has the Phyrexian Stifle. It's like, okay, I'll pact this Nas if you Phyrexian Stifle me in my upkeep.
It's a whole new world of possibilities for politicking and like just barely not spite plays. Yeah, I feel like yeah, it's sort of a weird one because I feel like it almost certainly has a place in like, okay, starting from the slowest and working forward. I think so. Curious Control definitely plays it, which is probably, is that the slowest blue deck in the format right now? It has to be, right?
I mean,
maybe just like teamer control stuff,
or like, I mean, it depends on what you count as in the format.
True. Wait, what are you thinking?
I mean, like, my mind immediately went to Baral, but I think there's stuff.
Okay.
There's stuff up from Baral that's still slower than Curious Control.
Okay.
But yeah, I think any
in terms of like decent decks that are very slow.
I think it probably goes into most decks that are already playing, like, if you're already playing a dozen counter spells, you're probably gonna find a slot for this one.
Yeah, okay. I think like probably literally every Thrasios deck plays it, right? Like that's probably one of the lines. Thrasvile Turbo. Does that deck even still exist? I don't think so.
I mean, it's the fine deck.
Nobody plays it. Dead deck. Yeah, I think every Thrasios deck would probably play it. The question is like, do you end up playing it in like T and K? So River's been playing Stifle a bit.
I think I actually really like it in T and K because it does allow you to like play you can do your like Thrasios Tymna impression where you just tap out on turn 2 for your Tymna, and start drawing cards, and having that like flexibility of, hey, I can do this and not think I'm just gonna die, is like a nice layer to add to that deck.
I think also, yeah, I guess like stifling Winota triggers is also pretty nice, or like stifling a Winota trigger on
stifling
turn 2.
a Winota trigger is pretty underwhelming, I would say.
I mean, buying you an extra turn in a deck that like really needs the extra turn a lot of the time there seems pretty neat. I don't know.
It just feels like,
yeah, it's like
you're pretty likely to be getting there, or sorry, like one Winota trigger is like just as likely to either whiff or not find anything that you actually care about
Right.
over the course of one turn. No, what it's really for is stifling your Urza triggers.
Oh, yes. Fuck you, Keegan. You don't get to have constructs. Yeah, I feel like you probably end up with the Phyrexian Stifle in like a majority of the blue decks in the format. I think probably the fastest stuff skips out on it.
Okay, but hear me out. You can stifle your own Mystic Remora upkeep trigger.
Oh my god. That'd been work. Wait, does cumulative upkeep put counters on as a cost?
No.
Or as a... No. They just go on?
Yeah, so like, it actually would be potentially good where, often with cumulative upkeep, you're not getting ahead because you're like spending the mana playing it.
Yeah, it's actually true, right?
Yeah, so
you go to turn 4 with a Remora tapping you down, and then you suddenly stifle it and have like a whole thing going on with a Remora up.
Or even like you could play it, like if you play it turn 1 or turn 2, and then like you just stifle it for a turn, and you use that to either get down some more mana or like maybe land a Tymna or something. Could be kind of spicy. Like, yeah, okay, you go turn 1 Remora, turn 2 land Dork, turn 3 you stifle the Remora trigger, you play Tymna, and you hold up a mana, and then like hit another land drop, and now you're playing on 2 mana, and you have a Tymna in play. Stonks.
This just in, Stifle, pretty good card in some situations. Yeah, I feel like you probably end up with Stifle in most of the blue decks in the format. Yeah, like the fastest stuff, obviously not. And then like potentially, I think like it's probably just because Stifle is one of those effects that like gets much better the more other counter magic you're playing. Like if you consistently have a piece of counter magic plus a Stifle in your hand, that's like an insane amount better than just having one or the other. Even having like 2 counter spells or like 2 stifles, because it just covers so much more. So, and yeah, I think it's probably in most stuff.
It does also. I think it is like. Generally, I don't like considering. I think people who have talked about like, particularly with interactions with Thassa's Oracle, how it leaves them in a worse position than just countering the consult.
Right,
but like. Particularly, I think stifling the Thassa's Oracle trigger after they've exiled their deck is actually a pretty like the value on that is enough higher than just countering the consult that it really is like an impactful factor.
Yeah, 100%. Like you're taking somebody out of the game completely versus them just like having a really awkward time winning.
Yeah.
Cool. Hope that was a valuable answer to the listener question. I think it's a pretty neat one, neat hypothetical. And then again, reminder, if you want a listener question on the show, you should go into our Discord and go do that. But I think that about wraps it up for this episode. If anybody listening would like to reach out to us with any questions, comments, or concerns, you can contact us on Twitter at Into the North Pod, via our email at intothenorthpodcast@gmail.com, or on our Discord server. The invite link for which can be found in the description for this episode. An extra special thanks to all of our patrons who will cover the expenses for our show and will allow us to work toward improving the quality of the podcast. If you too would like to become a patron, we are at patreon.com/intothenorthpodcast. Another way you can support us is via our TCG Player affiliate link. So anytime you want to purchase something from TCG Player, if you use our affiliate link, which is also in the description, a portion of your purchase goes towards supporting the podcast. Thank you, as always, to the band Vox Cadre for our lovely podcast music, and to Nate Slover for our equally lovely podcast logo. Next episode should be out in 2 weeks, and until then, see ya.
Bye.